right. Kapai. Well, we're going to get started now. Kia ora, everybody. My name is Alexandra Keeble. I am in the engagement team of the Deep South Challenge, Changing with Our Climate. And we're really excited to have lots and lots of you here with us today for the first in our rebranded seminar series. We actually took a little bit of time off over the COVID period. We just wanted to not be adding to the noise during a already fairly stressful time. But we're really excited to be back and to be kicking off with this very relevant and pretty timely seminar, DAM, Drinking Water, Decision Making and Drought, I think. We're setting the challenge for ourselves with this series of coming up with one-syllable word puns to name each of our seminars. So if you have a topic and a single-syllable word that you would like to see represented in our seminar series, then please do get in touch with us. But today we're hearing from Anita Wreford, our Impacts and Implications Program Leader, but also the project lead on a key research project in our Impacts and Implications Program, and also from Wageed Kamish, from a Senior Water Resources Engineer with Tonkin+Taylor. We're also lucky to have some of the modellers in the room whose work really underpins both of these research projects. We have Christian Zamit with us, whose hydrology work underpins Anita's research, and I'm fairly sure we have Abba Sood in the room whose work really supports Waheed's research. So we will be having some questions at the end, and the format of that I'll explain in a second. But if you do have questions about the modelling, then feel free to ask them, and we'll find a way to bring Christian and Abba into the conversation. But also we can follow those questions up after the seminar. We are hoping to keep the focus of today's seminar in the space of decision making in uncertainty and in an uncertain climate future. But of course, the modelling is a key part of that question. So we're thankful for Christian and Abba being here today. And one other guest, we have Dennis Jamison from ECAN, who brings a very important stakeholder perspective to the conversation today. Dennis reached out to us with a few key questions after an earlier stakeholder briefing that we ran, and Angela Halliday, one of our partnerships directors, had the wonderful idea to bring Dennis into the conversation to help us explore the bridge between theory and practice. So thank you, Dennis, for being here today. So just a little bit about a bit of housekeeping with Zoom and this webinar format. Webinars are slightly different from meetings. So you can see panelists, but we can't see you as participants. The way you can participate in the seminar is to either raise your hand in the chat panel and we can unmute you, or you can ask a question through the Q&A panel. Please don't type a question into the chat panel because it makes it a little bit difficult to be monitoring different sources of text. So if you have a text question, please use the Q&A panel, and other attendees can vote them up or down, but generally we manage to get through them all. So we'll have 15 minutes of Waheed first, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Anita, and then 5 minutes of Dennis, and then hopefully 15 to 20 minutes for questions, all things being equal. The other thing I want to note is that we, as always, will be making this seminar available on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So if you have to duck out, or you have others in your organisation wanting to participate who couldn't be here, there'll be that chance as well. The last thing to say is that we have 2 seminars remaining for this year. The next one is going to be on the 21st of October, and it will be a recap of Catherine Ion's important research into the RMA and local government liability for climate hazards. Of course, that's been thrown back up into the news again with the proposed reforms to the RMA. And our final seminar for the year in early December will be Belinda's story and her work on insurance retreat. So to make sure that you don't miss out, please sign up to our newsletter on our website. And without further ado, I will hand over to Wageed and ask him to share his, or to introduce yourself first, Wageed, and then to share your slides.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'm Wageed Kamish. I'm Senior Water Resources Engineer at Tonkin+Taylor. I'm sitting in the office today under level 3 restrictions, or level 2 restrictions rather. But the main reason I'm here is because my cat doesn't leave me alone when I'm working from home. So yeah, I'll jump into it. Let me just share my screen. And hopefully you can see that. You can see that, Alex?
Not yet, Wageed. Perhaps try again. Yes.
Okay,
There
cool. So I've sort of changed the title of my presentation a bit to be a bit more digestible. And it's towards quantitative determination of future water availability under climate change. I've got a personal connection with drought. I sort of came to New Zealand at the end of 2015 when Cape Town was in its first year of its 3-year drought, which turned out to be a 1 in 300 year drought. I saw bits of it, but my parents lived through all of it. And when I left, the dam storage was about 60%, and not knowing at that time that it would end up being 23% at the end of 2018. So I've got a personal connection with drought. Let me just click on here. A bit of an outline of the presentation. Why do it? Bit of background. Where does this fit in? Methodology is highlighted in red because that was one of the main deliverables from this project. How do you go about doing it? Some results from selected case studies. Limitations, there were quite a few of them. Some conclusions and opportunities for further work. So why did we do it? And this is my why. You might have otherwise. I think with competing demands into the future, we need to ensure that there is enough water for the environment, for people, and for economic activity. So it's an important why. We also need to undertake planning with the best available information. And if we accept climate change, it's sort of in the name, climate change, that things won't be the same as they were yesterday, the chance that extreme events occurring under a changing climate is not the same as it was historically. So that's sort of the main reasons why I saw this work as being important and providing a why for doing this work. In terms of the background, this project started off way back in 2018 with the climate change dialogues, where it sort of floated to the top as one of the main concerns that we weren't sure what our water availability was going to be under a changing climate. And the project that we undertook at that time was sort of to quantify the level of risk to drinking water supplies. It was conceptualized as an exploratory study. So it's not supposed to solve all the problems, but it's supposed to get people thinking about it. We wanted national coverage, and we wanted to make use of available data. And we partnered with NIWA, who's the custodians of climate change data, and they also produce updated drought indices, which is available under a separate report. I won't be talking about it today, but that report will also be made available. So where did we start? We started with the drought index that we had available at that time. So what this picture shows is the potential evapotranspiration deficit as projected into the future. The darker areas is where we could expect more drought, and the lighter areas, not so much. So when we selected our case studies, we focused on the darker areas because we sort of anticipated that that is where we would see the most effect of climate change. It didn't always turn out like that because we couldn't find perhaps a stakeholder that could assist us in terms of getting information for the water supply system. So we took a more pragmatic approach in the end. We selected these case studies, which is sort of spread across the entire country, a couple up in North Island, and then quite a few down in the South Island as well, just to give us a bit of spatial coverage. Where does this work fit in terms of how I conceptualize or the water management strategy that I grew up under? Water availability is one of the components that you need to look at in an adaptive integrated planning system. So there are other aspects that you need to look at, but water availability is the first one that you possibly need to address. Once you know your water availability, one of the things that you can do is reconcile your demands and your available water. And this is just an example from the Western Cape system analysis back in South Africa, where they know the water availability for current conditions. They sort of have an idea of what the demand is, and they can predict sort of when their system will run out of water and when they will need to bring on more schemes to supply water. So that's what you can do with it. In terms of the New Zealand context, the recently completed National Climate Change Risk Assessment identified a research priority in terms of the knowledge gap, in terms of drought, water supply and availability and demand. We are addressing only water availability in our study, but the ranking of that particular item came up quite high, and it had an adaptation urgency of 93%. So it's very topical. In terms of our methodology, we sort of looked back into how this is done on a historical basis. So one of the approaches that you can typically use is that you can look at your observed water inflow records to your water supply schemes. And then you can set up all sorts of stochastic models to produce alternative paths in terms of inflows. And then you sort of sit back and you hope that what we see in the observed record is representative of the true risk. And we hope that because we typically don't have long records, and all the variability that you need to see is possibly not in that available record that you have. And there's a nice quote that I just stole from Anthony Kim from his last webinar. The worst on record may not be the worst that has occurred. How do you account for that? So there's already uncertainty. So even in the determining historical water availability, there's uncertainty. If you move into the future, it becomes even more uncertain. And how do you mitigate that? Well, by using best available information, I think. So NIWA has got available global circulation models, which allows us to look into the future and come up with projected future scenarios. They also have these storylines, which sort of gives us an indication of how much carbon emissions could be in the atmosphere under the various storylines. And from there, we can get projected rainfall and evaporation, and we can get that for 6 global circulation models. and for the 4 RCPs, or representative concentration pathways. And these are all dynamically downscaled. So we've used a sort of mechanistic way of looking into the future. We've accounted for climate change because the models take that into account. And we can then use that dynamically downscaled rainfall and evaporation data and put it into a hydrological model. In this case, it was the TopNet model, which then produces projected stream flow. So you've got stream flow ranging from 1970s up to 2100 for 6 GCMs and for 4 RCPs. So the effect of climate change in the methodology is implicit. The tools that we had available, we had these climate models, which are available from that NIWA run. And we also had these RCPs going from low emissions to high emissions. And we also had the hydrological model, the TopNet model, which I'm sure Christian can tell you a whole lot more about. So in terms of what we observed when we put in those projected inflows, is that typically you see when your dam empties, and I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but this is exactly what you want to see. You want to see variability in your water levels, in your dam, in your storage, and then use that to infer the risk to supply. So what we then do in a nutshell is we impose a draft on the system, we stress the system, and then we check how many shortfalls we have. And then based on that, we can come up with the water availability versus the assurance of supply for a projected horizon. Just a very quick example from a result in the Waikato. It was a very small dam, 0.32 million cubic meters. It's got a current consent of 12,000 meters cubed per day. We subjected that to the analysis, and what we then see here is the water availability for current day conditions, and then water availability into the future for various RCPs, or representative concentration pathways. Based on our analysis, if we just focus on RCP 8.5, we can see that sort of 2040, there's not much change, but moving to 2060 and 2080, there's quite a considerable change in the water that's available. That would be important for planning purposes, to sort of show you when you should start focusing on looking at getting additional resources in place. Yeah, so, and moving on, there are a few limitations. So this study only focused on water supplies, surface water supplies, and not on groundwater supplies. Your streams that you were interested in had to be a certain size, Strahler 3. Otherwise, you were likely not to get it from the TopNet model. But it was just a limitation in this case. If you have your own hydrological model, you can use the rainfall from NIWA, and you can produce your own flows. It was an uncalibrated model. The model can be calibrated, however. There was just no time to do that in this case. And if you have your own hydrological model, you can, of course, calibrate it. Then the number of ensemble members. There's always a question in the back of your mind. Did we capture the full range of future variability? If not, then we're probably not showing the worst projected that could occur. You know, the worst projected may not be the worst that can occur. So it's the same question that we're asking for future scenarios that we have to ask for the historical scenarios. That question hasn't disappeared. And if we can find a way to increase the number of ensembles, we can increase the number of variabilities, increase the variability perhaps. Conclusions. We found that, so what's new from the study? I think that we've got a first generation methodology to use readily available information to come up with a quantitative determination of water availability. I think in New Zealand, this has probably been done on a qualitative basis before. Who should use it? Water suppliers, dam owners, resilience planners, local government, industry, irrigators. Everyone who's got to do with water can use it. When should it be used? Probably best at planning stages, so that you can look into the future and have an idea of what could happen. How should it be used? Well, one has to work with NIWA. They are the custodians of the climate data in New Zealand. You can set up your spreadsheet for your own water supply scheme. You need to know the needs of your environment, because that comes first. You need to know the limitations of the methodology, and you need to know what your demands are likely to look like into the future, or what your demand pattern is likely to look like into the future. And finally, on to acknowledgements. Obviously, the Deep South Science Challenge for allowing us to do this interesting work. I also want to sort of acknowledge NIWA, Dr. Brett Mullen, the late Dr. Brett Mullen, Abba Shud, and Christian Zammit for putting up with our requests for those modeling runs. My colleagues, John Hansford for the yield modeling, and Peter Cochran for his detailed review of the model. And then also the stakeholder reference group that guided this project in terms of the operational decision making and kept us sane when we got carried away. These are all their names there. Yeah, thanks to them as well. And that's it from me, Alex.
Oh, thank you so much, Wageed. That was really just such a great presentation. I've heard you present a couple of times now, but to me that felt possibly the clearest for someone who really does not understand hydrology at all. I just have a comment for our attendees today. Some of you are already beginning to ask questions in the question and answer panel, and that's great, but we won't get to them until after our two remaining speakers have had their turn. So, but do feel free to leave the questions while they're in your mind. Thank you. So we will pass now on to Anita Wreford, who isn't presenting from Lincoln University, but is presenting from NIWA Christchurch alongside Christian Zammit. So you'll need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, Christian's just helping with the technology here. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, although you'll need to maximize it. Yeah.
I'll go back to the start. Right, thank you.
And Anita, we can see, if you can change your view so that we can see the full screen, that would be wonderful.
Oh, okay, so we've got two screens. It's very confusing for us, or for me anyway.
Thanks.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, right. And I'm going to start my timer so I don't go on too long. But thank you very much for joining us today and tuning in. So yeah, as Alex said, I'm based at Lincoln University, but I'm here today at NIWA with my co-author, Christian Zammit, so he will be able to answer the hydrological questions. So this project was a joint effort, but mostly between Lincoln and NIWA, between economists and hydrologists mostly, and a colleague in the US. So today I'm really going to talk a little bit about the background for why we decided to do this work. I thought it would be useful, and then talk about our project. But I guess I want to emphasize that the interesting thing really is the method, more than the kind of detailed application that we did today. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about its wider application or the implications of this analysis. So We're looking at real options analysis for water storage because we need to think about ways to handle uncertainty and climate change. So we're getting more and more projections about climate change that are helping us make decisions, but we still have a lot of uncertainty, particularly around the timing, magnitude, and the location of changes. And actually, as we try and downscale and provide more localized information, with every layer of analysis, we actually add a little bit more uncertainty because of the uncertainty in our models and the uncertainty about future society. And so some of you might be familiar with this cascading uncertainty concept, so that with every layer we add a little bit more uncertainty actually. So by the time we come to make our adaptation decisions, that envelope of uncertainty is quite wide. And this can present challenges for the kind of decision-making tools that we've used in the past, where we haven't really had this same uncertainty. In New Zealand, as Wageed helpfully outlined first, we have a number of these different modelling processes that lead to increased information, but possibly also more uncertainty. So we have the representative concentration pathways, the RCPs, that Wageed talked about. We also have 6 climate models that we use in New Zealand, and then these are downscaled into a regional climate model. And in this project, we use this as inputs into the hydrological model. And so this is kind of adding those layers in, like in the previous slide. And with the 6 climate models and the 4 RCPs, we have a 24-member ensemble of potential futures that we need to handle, really. We can't just choose one of these. But this does present challenges. When we're thinking about the economics of investments, we generally don't want the costs of anything, of what we're doing, to exceed the benefits. When we're thinking about a large infrastructure investment, for example, we know what the costs are because we usually have to pay them now. We're doing the adaptation now, we have to pay for it now. But whereas the benefits are actually quite uncertain, we don't know when they'll occur, where, how large they'll be. And so this makes these comparisons quite difficult for our usual kind of approaches like cost-benefit analysis. And so we really need to start thinking about new ways of thinking and learning. So real options analysis is one way to try to improve these approaches that we have. So it's not a new approach in itself. It's been around for several decades in the financial economics area. But it's more recently, in the last 10 or so years, started to be applied to adaptation to climate change decisions. It's really suited for specific situations, so you wouldn't apply it to all. And the places where it is most useful is where we've got large, at least partially irreversible investments. So what we do now will be around for a long time. For that sort of situation, real options analysis can be helpful. So it's based on the idea that you leave your options open in the future. So you have the right, but not the obligation to act on them in the future, rather than doing something that is going to lock you into a certain path that might turn out to be unsuitable. So it builds on cost-benefit analysis, and actually a large part of it is cost-benefit analysis, but it includes the value of flexibility, and it allows for a range of climate futures. So there's 24 ensemble futures that I referred to in this case. And that's where it's very different from our usual financial investment tools, which usually assume one fixed path for future investment. It can get a little difficult or confusing because it is a slightly an umbrella term for a number of different techniques. The one that we use here is a decision tree approach, which is probably the most straightforward to apply. So we've applied it to the example of water storage in New Zealand because we know that water availability, well, it's already an important issue and it's likely to become more important under climate change. And we're applying it to the water storage for irrigation because New Zealand's economy is highly reliant on the primary sector. And water storage is an important adaptation to uncertainty. It's certainly not the only one, but once we've just, if you're in your context, if you've decided that water storage is something to explore, then this might help you explore it further. Water storage is a significant investment, of course. So this is why before we we invest, it's really useful to do this type of analysis to make sure we're not over or under investing. We use an example location in Canterbury, and the catchment that Christian did the work in is a real catchment with the real hydrological data, but it's not, our assumptions about the farm and whether they're building a storage pond or not is purely hypothetical, just to be clear about that. So a research question is really, what is the most cost-effective size to build the reservoir now to enable us to continue our current production? So we're assuming we want to continue production as it is into the future, with the option to extend it in a future in a way that minimises the whole lifetime, expected lifetime cost of the system. So the benefits that we calculate is the future production that we get from the land with irrigation compared to the production that we would be able to do without irrigation. And then the costs are, of course, the cost of constructing the reservoir and maintaining it. Ideally, you'd also include the opportunity cost of the land. In this particular case, we didn't do that, but that would be important to include in a more realistic application. Also, the cost of extending your structure if you need to. And we want to avoid both under or over investing. So over investing is where if we build a massive scheme and it turns out that actually we've got more water than we thought in the future and we've spent all that money that we didn't need to. And under investing is where we build it too small for our needs in future, and we then are not able to produce what we'd like to, and the cost of building it or extending it hasn't been factored in from the beginning. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the actual ROA process itself, but certainly you can talk to me afterwards or read the report. But the hydrological analysis which underpins it identifies the water storage requirements under all of those RCP-GCM combinations for every year out to 2090. So we made a number of assumptions about the farm, the size of it, the amount of water required, as well as keeping it within the reality of the ECAN's regional plan and the river water availability. And then the sizing, which Christian, I'm totally out of my depth talking about this, but he can definitely answer questions. But basically the capacity, the reservoir was sized to meet an 80% average annual supply reliability based on these 4 factors. So Christian and Channa provided us with these water storage requirements for those years, and that allowed us to construct a decision tree with 2 decision points. The first one in 2018, which was when we began the work, and the second in 2050. So depending on the context that this is applied in, you can choose different time points, decision points, and you can have more decision points. But the more decision points you have, the more complex the analysis is. And we just did ours in Excel. You could do it in a more complicated, a more detailed program, and that would probably allow you to have more complexity without making it unmanageable. So from Christian's work, they identified 4 storage sizes which would cover the range of water requirements out to 2049. And then another 4 sizes to meet the water requirements out to 2090. So that enabled us to construct a decision tree which had 256 branches. And it looked a little bit like this. This is one branch. So where this left-hand box is one of the storage sizes of the 4 that were identified, and that would lead to 4 outcomes in 2049 of different water availabilities. And for each of those outcomes, we would then look at the construction of the next 4 sizes in 2050, which would take us out to 2090, and each of them would have 4 outcomes. So it becomes quite big quite quickly. And we calculate the expected net benefit of each or the expected net present value, of each of those pathways. So that means we're calculating the costs and benefits as well as the probabilities of each pathway. And that was where that's one of the main challenges, I suppose, of ROA, is that we do need to think about the probabilities of the different futures. So there were a number of different approaches we could have taken, and we decided to assume that the climate models were equally likely, but we also played around with the probabilities of the RCPs. So we had two alternatives. One was where RCPs were equally likely, and one where we assumed the middle two RCPs were more likely than the extreme ones, the lower and the higher end. And so we took the 24 different futures and collapsed these into 4 non-overlapping hydrological conditions over time, and this allowed us to develop the probabilities of each of those branches. And Christian did that, which was a fantastic piece of work. So just quickly moving on to the results. So when we assume the RCPs are equally likely, it led us to the pathway of choosing the smallest construction in 2018, and again the smallest one in 2050. And so this is saying that although the storage capacity wouldn't cover all the potential requirements out to 2050 and then 2090, the benefits of having that didn't outweigh the costs. And I would also say that our calculation of benefits was quite simplistic, I suppose, related to milk price and soil moisture. And when you would if in a different context, you might spend a bit more time thinking about the benefits more. But I thought then the next one is actually quite interesting, in that when we assume different probabilities of the RCPs, it did change our decision. So it led to us choosing a larger, the second storage size in 2018, so it's larger than the first one. And then again in 2050, we went back to the smallest size. So this shows that the RCPs, the assumptions about the probabilities are very important and do make a difference to the choice that we might make. Just these are the same results basically, but just showing here the expected NPV for the different scenarios. So when we, this is the equiprobable strategy that was the first one I showed. And then we looked at the cost or the expected NPV if we had assumed the worst case scenario. So that was building the largest storage size in both time periods. And you can see that the difference in the NPV is quite significant. So we also played around with some sensitivities around the discount rate, the milk price and the construction cost. And these did make a difference to our choice of storage sizes in both time periods, and the details of those are in the report as well. So just thinking a little about the implications of this. So the probability distribution is important, and this, as I say, this is perhaps a limitation of ROA. On the other hand, I would say that it's still an improvement over just choosing one RCP and ignoring the others. And also as we go through time, we're getting more of an understanding of which RCP we might be on. So I think in further work and before we write this up as a journal article, we'll look at looking at the highest RCP and making that more likely, for example. The results are very specific to this example, of course. So in other cases, you might find that it was a bit more cost effective to choose a larger size earlier on. And the ROA can be applied to other types of decisions. So it's frequently applied for seawalls, hydro dams, wastewater treatments, also land use conversion, which is also potentially an irreversible decision. And also different types of decisions. So we looked at investing partially and retaining our options, but you can also look at investing now and deferring action. Also looking at abandoning projects potentially, or the value of new information. And there's a potential to look at this together with other types of research. So there's some new work coming out looking at ROA together with dynamic adaptive pathways. And there's also potential for simpler applications. So rather than, we can sort of take the principle of the decision trees, but use more qualitative information around that, if that was of interest. And just concluding, I guess, because of the risk of lock-in and sunk costs, this kind of valuation is really important when we have such an uncertain future. The way that you do the ROA can be really tailored to your specific context. So this was just one application. And it is relatively accessible. As I said, we used ours in a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet. It's a little time consuming, but certainly very accessible. The hydrological data is another matter. Of course, you have to have access to that through our friendly NIWA people. But just, yeah, coming back to the point that although, you know, we've got to play around with some of these tools. It's not perfect, but we definitely need to have new ways of thinking and learning. And this is one potential way to support that. So thank you.
Thank you, Anita. That's really wonderful. I'm going to quickly introduce Dennis Jamieson, who is using his skills as a water infrastructure specialist to support infrastructure owners and personnel across Canterbury as part of the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. Dennis, we had been having a little trouble with your sound earlier. Can we hear you now?
Yes, I hope so.
We can. Wonderful. So if you could speak for, you know, sort of between 3 and 5 minutes, that would be wonderful. We've lost your vision now.
That's okay. I'm just going to put a quick slide up here.
Oh, great.
And because I've just got some very simple views. So I'm not speaking as a researcher, obviously. And first thing is you'll see the mention of the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. That's a strategy.
We actually can't, Dennis, we can't see your slides. Are you able to share your screen?
And so it might be taking a moment. Let's have a look. The share button's definitely pushed.
It is. Okay, sometimes it does take a little while. Or perhaps try unsharing and sharing again. Alternatively, Angela, if you're there, you might be able to find the slides.
Yep, I'm just having a look now.
Wonderful. Perhaps, Dennis, you could just start speaking anyway while we quickly scramble in the background to get those slides loaded.
Great. Okay, so the approach I have is based on, hang on, I can see something. Oh, maybe you've shut down my video. I'll go back to share because, yeah. But anyway, look, my views as a stakeholder are based on the importance of systematic approaches. This is really important because there's a lot of political risk at the moment. That's not something I've put into a slide, but there's a great risk around people identifying predetermined and wrong solutions and rushing off to implement them. So having these good infrastructure practices of mobilising data and information and getting it into an objective framework is an important part of countering that. So, you know, the real options assessment and the yield modelling are really important components. The importance of these approaches is they consider all factors on the demand and the supply side. You can look at resilience items, and that might include geological resilience, where you've got parts of water networks that might be isolated by earthquakes. Tamana OTY is the latest reminder that in New Zealand we put the environment ahead of other factors. And of course, climate change in a systematic approach is really just another scenario. So this hopefully reduces climate change scenarios to something that's relatable and understandable. And the modelling approaches that have been outlined today are probably quite intimidating for a lot of people. There's a lot of detail, but the overall approach of these models is to take a humongous amount of information and to work towards getting it into a form that normal people can relate to. So that's my confidence in that process. And in terms of how these approaches will have an impact, there's 3 groups that stand out as important to me. One is the water infrastructure personnel, and particularly in 3 waters, there's a shortage. There's a huge job ahead, and we do not want to lose our 3 waters personnel, our skilled people we have now. We want to support them with better tools. The public is looking for increasing involvement. At the moment, a lot of the discussions around very political type matters and conspiracy theories, and it's a matter of getting back to dealing with the real situation and flows in water. And a third important group that we interact with in Canterbury is with iwi, to reinforce the generational approach and multi-factor prioritised and balanced perspectives. That's really important. When we look across different infrastructure organisations, we find that the electricity industry can work with 70-year timelines, and it's always good to have people in the room thinking that way. So that comes down to where does this work go next? And from what I've seen and from listening to councils from Waitaki in the south to Kaikoura and beyond, is that there's a bit of gap filling and innovation required here for next steps, which is outside the research program. It's about better incorporation of groundwater, which is a big issue. It's about customising for usability to smaller systems and their communities, not just large networks, which Wageed mentioned. It needs to be applicable to all parts of New Zealand. And a good potential partner for this work would be the Council Future Water Infrastructure Organisations, which are being formed through councils working together. And of course, a big factor with this is going to be communication with wide audiences, because there is a lot of community interest, particularly on the demand side, where there's a lot of interest in rainwater tanks, water-sensitive design. In irrigation, we have a lot of new methods being brought to our market to reduce water use. In many cases, there might be investments that are non-infrastructure investments that are valuable. And the final point I wanted to share was that because I'm an optimist, there are examples of good practice, and I've picked out one from Wellington Water. They have something called a risk-based approach to drought resilience in the water industry. They've just published it as a case study in the International Infrastructure Management Manual, which is published by the Institute of Public Works Engineering Australasia, the IPWEA. Now, that's not an organisation I've had much to do with, but I find that a lot of people in territorial authorities know about that very well. And Wellington's a very good case study, because they originally developed the model a long time ago, I think it's over 20 years, to deal with the impact of rising minimum flows in rivers. But since then, they've continued to apply that model to every new challenge, whether it's been climate change or geological risks, where they were looking for where to put storage in their network. So there's a story of optimism here that these are the sort of tools that are needed, and the next step is to find ways of mobilising them. So that's my stakeholders' perspective.
Thank you very much, Dennis. It's so great to have you here in the room with us today. And thank you, Angela, for sharing those slides. So we have quite a few questions in only 10 minutes, and I'm going to sort of try and group them together as much as possible. And for those of you who are still asking questions, can you please indicate whether you have a preferred speaker to answer the question for you? The first two questions are for Wageed. A quick one about why you chose to use 2005 as your benchmark for comparison, but also a question from Bapon. How do you think we can analyse and access an integrated approach for future climate change to increase the demand for the macro level planning for urban water governance? So a quick question and a long question, perhaps.
Yeah, I'll answer the long question first. To Bapon. I think that requires a systematic approach. As I get the feeling he's talking about integrated water resources management and tools for monitoring that. Not something that can be done in one go, but requires sort of a piecemeal approach addressing various sectors of the integrated water cycle at a time. So I suppose in New Zealand, the first step would be what's your conceptual framework that you're going to use, and then coming up with a sort of analytical framework to implement that.
And 2005?
The 2005 one was probably a bit more arbitrary. We had sort of hydrological analysis, which sort of represented the historical period, and I think Christian can correct me here. It went from 1970 to not sure which.
To 2005. That's the UNCAS period for IPCC,
yeah,
which
so
is 86, 2005.
Yeah, so we just used 2005 to represent the historical and compared everything else relative to that.
I'm going to put two questions together from Morag and from Catherine Ions. So Morag asks, what about costs? I think this is for Anita, thinking about costs. What about costs to the environment of higher production, such as runoff and leaching associated with irrigation? And from Catherine Ions, can we include human health costs, for example, bowel cancer from high nitrate levels?
Yes, no, so both of those are great questions, and yes, you can. I mean, you can make this analysis as comprehensive or as simple as you need to for your particular context. So you would just need to work out ways to capture those costs and then include them in the cost benefit equation. So absolutely, it just depends on how much effort you want to put into really fully presenting the picture of the full costs and benefits.
Okay, and a question from Jeremy, which I'm going to pose it to Wageed. I think that's the best way to go. How can we account for changing hydrological regimes, for example, extreme events, recharge, abstraction, when modelling the impacts of climate change using historic observations?
Well, I think if I understand the question correctly, you're trying to figure out how do you account for those in the flows that we are producing. If you're doing it for historical flows, typically the model is calibrated against an observed record. And you've got sort of certain objective functions that says whether your calibration is good or not, and you sort of assume that you've represented the change in your catchment. If you're looking into the future, it's a bit more difficult. You don't know how those things are going to change and how it's going to affect your hydrological, your hydrology of the catchment. But typically your catchments are your reservoirs are situated high up in your catchment and remain fairly natural throughout their lifetime. So if you're using sort of naturalized flows generated from those catchments into the future, I think it's still a good assumption.
Okay, thank you. A question from Santiago. I think this is for Anita. Neat analysis, thank you. How could you build in land use change to an alternative land use that's not as thirsty and alternative sources, for example, groundwater? Could those be treated as additional branches alongside the 4 construction options at each decision point? Or you'll need to unmute yourself, Anita.
Thank you. Sorry, interesting question, Santiago. Christian and I were just discussing that. So you probably could, but so if you included them as additional decision points and branches, it would just increase the complexity. And I guess we'd need to think about how, because the other construction options are based on water availability. And so you'd probably need a different cost and benefit analysis for those different land uses and the water use. But I mean, it's something to explore, definitely, but just a bit scary about how complex it would probably make it. I don't know if you wanted to say anything, Christian. Or...
No, it's possible. It's really how complicated you need to go and potentially up to what level you want to go in order to still be able to see something among an ensemble which is going to increase by a factor 4. Every time you add a decision tree or a decision variable, you are going to increase by a factor 4.
And I guess it's whether ROA is really the most appropriate tool to consider that. But still, I just would probably need a little bit more time to think it through. But thanks.
Thank you. A question from Leslie. Kia ora, Leslie. Is anyone publishing or working on guidance to help people understand probability or factors influencing the probability of the different RCP pathways and the probabilities of NZ models so they can understand when to apply them? It's a difficult question.
Yeah, so I mean, that's obviously something that we came up across in our project and have tried to address a little bit, I think, and it's something Daniel, Christian and I were also talking about, that we should write this up and think about a bit more about how we can improve that analysis. And Daniel Collins, I see, is on the call, and he really helped think that through in the early parts of the project as well. So I mean, the answer is we don't know the probabilities, but we can sort of make assumptions around them, and probably some guidance for practitioners would be useful, as well as for the more detailed academic studies. So we're thinking
Also, Leslie, now that you're a key member of our representative user group, it might be something that you might be able to help us work on separately, not to throw you under the bus. So a question here from Daniel. Kia ora, Daniel, nice to hear from you. And a question for Wageed. How do you propose to make useful design decisions about water supply risk, given that modelling of low flows is notoriously poor, including in the model you're using, according to our own research?
Yep, that's a very important question, because when you're designing, sizing reservoirs, the determining factor is really how you represent those low flow periods. One has to use a calibrated model to reduce uncertainty in the flows that you are producing. And I mean, I've used several hydrological models that couldn't successfully reproduce or low flows, but one has to do the best that you can in trying to do that. And it is critical, because that determines the size of your reservoir to actually supply at the level of assurance that you wish.
Thank you, Wageed. And amazingly, we have one question and 2 minutes remaining, so this will be our final question. I'm assuming it's for Anita.
Yeah.
Anita, I'll just read the question out so that it's recorded on the record. While calculating the real options analysis, did you put a financial value or cost on water itself? And what river was the modelling done on? I think you did describe that.
Thanks, Paul. So no, we didn't put a value or cost on water, but again, like in my answer to the previous questions about what we included in costs, you could. And I'll let Christian answer the question about what river it was based on.
It was a branch of the Rangitata.
Perfect. Okay, well, that takes us to 1 minute before 1 p.m, just on time. A huge thank you to everyone who's come out today, taking some time out from your lunch, which is really, we're just grateful for that. And thank you very much to Anita and Wageed and all of the researchers who supported your projects. As I said, the recording will be available tomorrow on YouTube, and please tune in for our next seminar with Catherine Irons. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.